The first right whale, I'm trying to remember the order of things. I think it was the one in Virginia Beach. I'm trying to remember between two cases which one came first. There was a whale in Virginia Beach, adult right whale that we went down to examine that had been entangled in line for a long time. And so this case was one of the many cases that's written about in the mortality paper that we published a couple of years ago, where the line was so deeply embedded in the pectoral flippers that the bone itself was growing and formed this horrible lesion. You could just see how deeply that line was cutting into the bone, and that bone was trying to repair. Yep, it's that case. The bone was trying to repair itself, but wasn't able to do that because that line was still persisting there. So that was a very profound case to see this, this line that took down this huge whale, and just to look at those wounds and those lesions and see how devastating they were. Because of the wounds. So combination of things. So again, work that my mentor Michael Moore and some of his grad students had done looking at entanglement as a costly life stage like pregnancy, similar energetic costs for being entangled. And part of that is because of the increased drag. So they have to exert more energy to swim, dragging whatever it is that they're dragging. Even a piece of line, you wouldn't think that that would cause an increased energetic burden, but it does. So there's that aspect of it, of the actual drag from the entangling gear. Some of these animals do also have, when their mouth is involved, oftentimes right whales are entangled and have some aspect of it in their mouth because they're often encountering the line when they're feeding. And so for those animals, there certainly can be. So for this whale in particular, there was kind of a cluster of rope in the back of its throat that certainly could have impacted its ability to feed. There's other animals that have been documented where the line actually goes all the way around their rostrum, so we think that their jaws are actually held shut by the entangling line. So that certainly obviously impacts an animal's ability to feed. And then the other piece of it is the body, obviously for this animal in particular, is spending all that energy to try and heal that. And so it's obviously increased energy expenditure because the body is constantly trying to make that wound better and failing, and so there's increased energetic costs there as well. So it's quite the burden on these animals, and the cost of pain as well. I mean, I think pain is something that we're even still learning about, the impact of chronic pain in humans and what that really does to an overall organism's existence, and we know obviously very little about that in whales, but they're obviously sentient beings and feel pain, so it's fair to draw some similar conclusions there in the cost of chronic pain. So the interbirth interval has increased. It used to be about 3 years, and now it's like 7 years. So they're having calves less frequently. There's a bunch of different hypotheses about that. One of which is maybe it's all just due to the energetics. So maybe it's partially due to climate change impacting them having to go further to find their food. Maybe part of it has to do with the energetic costs of being entangled. So there was a study a couple of years ago looking at, the whales that had been previously entangled are shorter. And so is it actually physically impacting their ability to reproduce? And those are questions we just don't know the answer to. But certainly one of the big things for us at necropsies is looking at the reproductive tract to see if there's another reason that we've missed that might be impacting their ability to reproduce. Is it just that they're not finding each other out there? Does it have to do with ocean noise? Or is there something else going on? Is there some level of contaminant or hormone disruption that we haven't detected that might actually be physically impacting their ability to conceive? We don't know. And we don't know where along the We don't know if they're not mating. We don't know if they're not conceiving. We don't know if they're aborting early. And we don't know if maybe they're having calves and then the calves are dying shortly thereafter. So there's so many steps in the process that might be impacted, and we're really just starting to look at that. It's a really hard thing to study. Gosh, there's a lot of really heartbreaking cases. So this whale that I had pulled up was a right whale calf that was born in the early 2020. And so this animal was only a couple of months old when it died in June. And this whale, we necropsied in New Jersey. And this animal had been hit twice by two different vessels, is what our necropsy showed. And so this is the animal. So you can see that there's this line of propeller scars here that went across the head. And then there's this, what looks very different back here. And so this animal was actually hit by a vessel on her head. And then about 2 weeks later, what ended up actually killing this animal was a vessel running across the peduncle, and it severed all the tendons there, it severed the spinal column, and basically made it impossible for the animal to swim, and the animal bled out fairly rapidly. But it had lived with this across its head for 2 weeks prior to dying. And so as we looked at the head of this animal, so this rostrum should extend down here. So basically that front part of the top of the animal's mouth, head, had been severed off. And so you can see this is where all the different propeller wounds were. And you could see there was evidence of healing there. So this young animal had been hit in the head, and this is an animal that's still nursing. And so this animal was likely not able to really nurse very effectively after that. And then the final kind of, so you can see the bones here, there's hemorrhage in that's fractured jaw. And so there's hemorrhage there. It's just the bones are shattered in a whole bunch of different pieces. And so again, this little whale that was so young, just a couple months old at the time, just had these horrible wounds. And then this was the kind of the last, the nail in the coffin, I guess, of this poor young whale. At the time, I had just had my daughter a couple of months earlier, and so she was almost like a similar age to this whale. So this one hit me particularly hard. But also, this animal's mother is snow cone, and she has a long and sordid history of becoming entangled multiple times. And she was a whale that had become entangled recently. Let's see if I can pull up her case, but she, there we go. So she was reported entangled in 2022, and she had another calf with her, a new calf. So after she lost this calf, she got pregnant, she had another calf 2 years later. And so that was encouraging, but then she was seen with an entanglement, and her calf was playing with the entangled line as she's swimming off the calving grounds off of Florida and Georgia. And then there was a point in time where we thought, ooh, maybe the line's not actually there anymore. Maybe it's not embedded. And then we got these pictures where she has this line, this teeny little line that's deeply embedded in the top of her head, kind of in that rostrum, similar to where her young calf that we necropsied had those awful propeller wounds. And then following her case, so knowing that, I necropsied her calf in 2020, and then following her case 2 years later of this entanglement, we hoped maybe it wasn't so bad. There were a lot of discussions with groups of experts getting together to talk about how do we, because these rostrum or bonnet wraps was what this line is right here, are really, really difficult, really dangerous for the disentanglers. I don't know if that team talked to you about that, but it's a really dangerous thing to do. And so we were talking about, should we go out and help sedate this animal to make it safer for both the whale and the disentanglers? So there were many, many discussions about this whale in particular. And then unfortunately, the last update we got was this, and she had picked up another set of entangling gear. Her health had declined significantly. So all these light patches on her, these are all cyamids, and her skin was really pale, and she looked really skinny. And that was the last we saw of her, and that was 2.5 years ago. So basically assuming at this point that she died shortly thereafter, and just knowing how sad and how tragic her life had been, and the lives of her calves as well. It's just, she in particular I found especially heartbreaking. So yeah, there's a lot of really sad right whale stories, unfortunately, right now. But she was one that hit really close to home for me. The climate is a little challenging to be optimistic. I hope so. I mean, there's been glimmers of it in the past, and there are real solutions. Ropeless fishing is a real solution, and it's right there. And so I still have a sliver of optimism that's kind of coated in a shroud of pessimism at the moment. But yeah, I mean, I think we can figure it out. It's just which side of human culture is going to win. Is it the greed and the consumerism, or is it the like, oh, you know, can we come to a point where we have a more holistic view of our role on this planet? Mm-hmm. I'm optimistic. There are a lot of really good people out there. So yeah. We'll just keep fighting the fights.
What is your opinion on the campaign when we went and talked with Regina?
It's a hard question to answer, because would it impact the average American's life on a day-to-day basis? Probably not. Is it kind of the first species to go, and will we eventually lose all our great whales? Probably, if we continue with what we're doing and how we're using the oceans. So I see it as kind of the first step towards this eventual disaster. And if we lose all of our great whales, yeah, there will absolutely be ecosystem level impacts. They will impact how the fish populations are. So yeah, it will probably end up impacting what people eat for dinner. And so it will have those real impacts. So yeah, I guess I see it as the first step in kind of the direction, if we keep going, will be eventually we're going to lose all those whales, and those ecosystem dynamics will change massively, and that will impact individual people and livelihoods as well. So the people that depend on those oceans for fishing as a livelihood, they will be impacted too. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like we as humans are morally responsible. We know that it's our actions that are leading to this species extinction. And so, yeah, I mean, I do feel like we have a moral obligation to prevent that from happening. And so, yes, I think the challenge that has existed in motivating conservation of right whales in particular is there's just, people need to want to do it. And it's almost more of I think for many years as scientists, we're like, oh, we'll just collect more data. We'll show people why this is happening, and that will make them care. But we've done that. We have decades of necropsy data, and it hasn't changed the hearts and the minds. And so I think, honestly, what we should have been doing for the past 20 years is having sociologists and social change makers being that voice for these animals. And you really do have to change hearts and minds to make people want to save them. So I guess that is a question of morality. It's a question of will, in terms of people don't like things that impact their kind of freedom, especially in this country. And so I think there's those two things are kind of at odds in saving them. Like, oh, but you have to slow my ships. Yeah, I guess it comes down to morality. It comes down to morality. It comes down to a desire and a willingness to change your behavior and how you live your life to save a species. Humans haven't been super good about making sacrifices for other species, unfortunately, unless it impacts them. Okay, so, sorry. So this was what the flukes, the tail of 5120 looked like at the necropsy. And so it's even more challenging to interpret the entanglement scars and wounds when you have an animal that's been towed and then taken out of the water and then put on a truck and trucked to a place where you can necropsy it. So that makes our jobs even more complicated. So you can see this abrasion here that was actually from part of that process. And so we have to be able to tease that out based on what the tissues look like to say, no, that was actually post-mortem abrasions there. But what we're seeing in these other places were actually there when the animal was alive. And so, for instance, what we saw here, this was just kind of an open gaping wound here, but that actually, what happened was this line that was embedded in there popped out when we flipped the whale from its back to rest on its belly. And so what we were also able to see here, so there were basically two parallel deep wounds into, this is the right side of the tail, so the flukes extend off here and here, so you're looking basically at the base of that tail. So we knew that there were two sets of line, and there were two lines in each of those that went deep into that right side of that tail insertion, fluke insertion. And then there was still intact around this dorsal aspect of the tail stalk. You could see a line here that has a knot in it, as well as that second line. And then we could see that on the other side, those lines dove back in and were deeply embedded in the tissue on that other side. The other things that we saw in this, you can kind of see a bunch of white marks, but actually in the trailing edge of the left fluke blade, there was this notch where there was no gear present. So this is the median fluke notch. So that's where normal fluke notch, where the whales two blades of their tail come together. And you could see that there's this white scarring kind of around that fluke notch there. And then you could also see this basically V-shaped notch in that trailing edge of that left fluke blade. And then in addition to that, so that was partially healed, there was some regions of red tissue there. We cut into it, we could see a tissue reaction as well as scarring down. But then there was this additional abrasion here. So we saw no gear present either within that median fluke notch or within this not anatomically normal fluke notch here with these abrasions. And so from that, we decipher that there was a prior entanglement that likely wrapped that fluke blade, even though it wasn't there when we were examining the animal. And when we went back and looked at the animal's documents from the Center for Coastal Studies when she was alive, we could see that there was actually a line that did likely wrap that fluke blade and cause this laceration here of the trailing edge of the flukes there. But when we went back and looked, so we get these kind of glimpses into maybe where this line used to be, in that we can see there's obviously two pieces of line deeply embedded here, two pieces of line deeply embedded here, but then we also see suggestions that there may have been additional wraps or that the gear may have shifted from a more kind of caudal perspective to a more cranial position, potentially before it got embedded, or there was additional gear there. So these are kind of the little clues that we look for to understand how this animal was entangled in the gear. And so then what we do essentially is take what we see and we try to make diagrams. I'm an absolutely horrible artist, so I do my best to try to make it representative of what we saw in real life, because when you look at those images, it's really hard to put all the pieces together. So that's kind of, that was essentially what it looked like when we saw it from the dorsal aspect, and then the ventral aspect, which is what we looked at originally when the animal stranded. You can actually see the tissue bulging on those sides, and so that tells the story that those entanglements, that plus how embedded they were, tells the story of duration for those entanglements, that they were there for a very long time. So let me see if there's anything else. I think any of these whales, and there have been too many, where you are physically inside that wound, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand how long the whale had lived with it, or it's a very, necropsy in and of itself is a very intimate process where and I mean, with this whale, I was literally inside the whale that was slightly floating in a little bit of water, and so, you know, you come out and you're covered in this whale's bodily fluids. Yeah, these cases hang on tight, and you, yeah, I mean, there's always the second guessing. There's always things you're like, oh, I wish I had done this. I wish I had done that. And it's all because you feel this like huge obligation to these animals, that, you know, you follow their life stories, and then they end up on your beach, and then that's your job to do some kind of justice, to make something out of it. Yeah. Slightly better image there, kind of where all the different lesions are. So we use our forensic tools to mark the images and note them, and so we could see that there was some hemorrhagic tissue as well as fluid on the cut surface of those lines. And then this is cutting into that pectoral flipper, and it was just filled with this like red fluid that's not supposed to be there.
It's not blood, or?
Yeah, it's probably blood and inflammatory, yeah, basically not pure blood, but inflammatory fluid, basically. But yeah, so this was a tricky one to take apart, but then you see on the other flipper, you see this dorsal aspect here, you see tissue here, so these guys get a little bit more challenging to interpret. But you can see that's a very clear linear demarcation of kind of discoloration in that pectoral flipper, indicating that was previously entangled, even if you don't have the skin to really work with from a scar standpoint. But that again is our diagram of where we saw those lesions. And yeah, this thing was very decomposed little friend, but anyway.
I think, thank you for that.
Yeah.